Hello, welcome to this video.
When I was 6 years old, at school, we were taken into assembly to see a musical ensemble that had been brought in to entertain us. It was, if I remember rightly, it was 4 clarinet players. They were probably about 10 or 11 years old, only a few years older than me, but when they walked in, they seemed a lot older. The teacher introduced the ensemble and they began to play. As I started to listen to what they were playing, I noticed that everything seemed to have changed. I was aware of an aspect of experience that I hadn't come across before. The music seemed to transform the room. I seemed to be taken to a different place. It instilled emotions in me that were very specific, but I could not put my finger on. But the only way I can relay what it was like was suddenly being aware of being in the moment and being in that space. I could hear the clicks of the fingers on the keys of the clarinet. I could hear the woodiness. I could hear the sound reverberating around the assembly hall that we were sat in. I was aware that I was in a moment. I was aware that this moment would last for a certain time and then be gone, but it was transformative. I've never forgotten that. I've loved music since I was a tiny child, a babe in arms. But at 6 years old, I suddenly became aware of an aspect of music that I could not put into words. It seemed to create in me some sort of magnetic centre which drew to me anything to do with music. I was fascinated by musical instruments. I was fascinated by records. I was fascinated by different musicians. I was fascinated by songs on the radio. I would go down to the bottom of the garden and try and sing these songs. I would wanted to be able to be a part of that. And I would act out playing guitar and drums and bass. Eventually, you come into contact with various instruments. Up at my grandparents' a piano in the front room that we weren't allowed to really go into. An old classical guitar that my dad had for Christmas. And eventually, I uncovered a pair of drumsticks that had belonged to my dad that were tucked away in his wardrobe. I grabbed them out and they were fantastic things because it meant I could go around and start tapping music on absolutely everything. I didn't begin as a drummer because I didn't have a drum kit until 2 years after I'd started playing. I began by playing everything else. The chairs, the tables, bushes in the garden, old jumpers, anything that could be hit, I would tap and I would try and extract that exquisite rhythm out of it, and it was fascinating to me. Music to me was transformational. As I got older and I started to study music, I found that I was able to express myself more and more. And the more I could express myself, the more I could get in touch with this thing that I felt when I was 6 years old. I feel like there was some sort of great big scale that I was ascending in working through music. I felt that there was an upward trajectory. I was listening to all sorts of music, but eventually After listening to my dad's jazz record collection intensely, I discovered heavy metal. Heavy metal was exciting and visceral. It didn't have that connection, it didn't have that spiritual connection that I felt in that music that I heard when I was 6 years old in that assembly room. It had something else. It was vital and exciting. I was 12 years old and I wanted the world to be an exciting place. I wanted to be able to jump off cliffs, off bungee jumps, to go in aeroplanes. All these things, all the promise of excitement that my life in the future held was personified in bands like Iron Maiden and Motorhead. But the music had other aspects in it, and I felt like I was ascending this scale. And eventually I discovered, from heavy metal to heavy rock, from heavy rock to classic rock, and from classic rock to progressive rock. Two bands that really opened up another world of music for me, and they were Yes and Rush. The first album I ever bought by Rush was Moving Pictures. On that album, it opens up with the tune Tom Sawyer, which is full of all the excitement that you expect from heavy rock and heavy metal. Incredible riffs, incredible drum fills, it's dynamic. But there was a moment in that record where it suddenly all changed. It was as though the music took a right turn into some other world. The harmony expanded out, the production expanded out, and Geddy Lee sang, the world is love and light, a deep. It was a spiritual message. Earlier in the week I did a review of the incredible album by Brad Mehldau called Jacob's Ladder. What was interesting to me listening to this album is I was aware that Brad Mehldau had had a similar experience with the track Tom Sawyer, and that album opens up with that line, the world is love and light and deep. That Rush line repeated over and over again like an incantation, like a prayer. This album expresses Brad Mehldau's belief in God, his faith in God. But the music of Rush and Yes took me down a different path. And by the time I was in my late teens, I was an absolute atheist with no belief in God whatsoever. I felt that my God was music. The thing that I applied myself to, the altar that I sat in before and worshipped, was the music of my heroes. Some of those heroes were searching. John Coltrane, John McLaughlin. I was aware that that feeling that I had at 6 years old was deeply embodied in that music. That music was also uplifting. It was looking upwards. It was climbing upwards. It was trying to take humanity from a level here, a lower, to a higher level. But I was also a huge fan of Frank Zappa and Miles Davis, and their music was also uplifting, but in almost the opposite way, in that their music was at the level of the street, at the level of human beings. It expressed our humanity at the basic level, but in a beautifully incredible way. There were two aspects of the same thing, two aspects of the same idea or feeling or concepts embodied in this music. And very often these musicians that came from this spiritual place and these sort of very materialistic musicians that were rooted in the reality of the world, they would work together and the things would mesh together. I became very aware that there was two aspects to life. As I got into my late teens, I also started to suffer with extreme anxiety. Unknown to me was the fact that the anxiety was induced by the thought of chaos. But to me, it was better explained by the word catastrophe. I was terrified that there would be in the future at some point a catastrophe, and that my purpose was to try and avoid such a catastrophe. But what I did not realise is that the catastrophe was actually my life, and the thought of my life descending into chaos, of losing control. When I listened to the music that I love so much, I could hear in it that aspect of chaos. But also, I realised that there was an uplifting aspect to music. If I could get out of the tyranny of the future as a sort of overwhelming energy that was controlling my life, if I could just exist in the moment, even for a few minutes, it was like a therapy to me. And I felt that if I could just get on my drums or my guitar and play, I could get to a point where the future and the past no longer mattered. But the only way to attain that was through practice, was through diligence. The motivation to practice for me came out of not a conscientious approach to life, more the fact that I wanted to avoid falling into the pit of chaos, falling into the pit of catastrophe. My life was at once tortured by the thought of catastrophe, and at the same time the thought of being able to get in that space. I came up with terminology for these things. I described what I was doing when I was moving downwards to the place of chaos as catastrophizing. But the state music took me to, I described to myself as the eternal now. It was the ability to actually see our life as it actually is, an eternal now. It became apparent to me that these things were at odds, but at the same time were not at odds. That within each aspect, the other aspect was inside it. I felt that when I was playing music, that to attain that space was not through ethereal and quiet and relaxing music, but was from violent, aggressive music. That energy that I heard in Motorhead when I was 12 years old, I now heard in the music of John McLaughlin or John Coltrane. John Coltrane was searching, he was trying to find that space. He was trying to find that place. It was deeply spiritual, but it was also full of the chaos that he was trying to escape. Someone like Miles Davis seemed to embrace chaos. He seemed to enjoy putting musicians in situations where they didn't know what was going on. He had no expectations of what the outcome would be. He seemed to be pulling new and exciting music out of the air by not thinking of the future. It was entirely chaotic, but within that chaos was an incredible order. I felt that I was splitting the world in half into these two aspects, when really, for very small moments in time, they united. Chaos and order held each other's hands. And I was pretty sure that is what I heard in that assembly hall when I was 6 years old. Coming from quite a scientific background, both on my parents had come from a scientific background, I was brought up with the idea of the material world. It was based on the fact that what we know is what there is. That there was no supernatural place. That there was no heaven, there was no hell. There was no platonic space. What there was material reality. And what we could see, and then from what we could deduce from what we could see or hear or measure, was how we elucidate truth. To this day, I still believe that that is the best way of elucidating truth. But what is interesting is the limits of truth. What I experienced at 6 years old, and what I experienced at 15, 16 years old when I heard John Coltrane, was not an expression of truth. People would describe it as being true, but I knew it had nothing to do with truth. It had to do with emotions, and that's why it could act as a temperer, act as a control, a noise gate to my emotions. There was emotional realm and there was a factual realm. The factual realm came from an awareness of the material world around us. But more interestingly, it was aware of the fact that this material world existed, had existed, and existed in the future. It was based upon the idea that there were laws, that they were universal laws, and these laws governed how the material world worked. Science was the method that human beings had developed to elucidate truth, and it worked. I became very grateful as I became aware of our history on this planet, as I became aware of the amount of times that human beings walked the earth without any technology, without any knowledge of the material world or the laws of thermodynamics or Newton's laws of physics. For hundreds of thousands of years we existed as hunter-gatherers, and we existed in the realm of superstition. Our understanding of the world came not from the ability to stand outside our eternal now, our material reality, and inflict upon that time as a measurement, and then within that deduce what had happened and what may happen in the future. That was not the way that human beings on this earth had existed. We had existed in the realm of dream and in the realm of emotion. We'd assumed that spirits existed within the trees, within the wind. We imagined that when somebody disappeared, that somehow they must carry on. They can't no longer exist. It is just the fact that they have left the room or left the cave. And so from that, they believed in the spirit world and things were embodied by these spirits. And they turned to these spirits to try and control and avoid catastrophe. They would ask the spirits to guide them. Eventually, human beings moved from many spirits to one spirit, God. And ancient stories that had hovered for hundreds of thousands of years, passed down through generations, that had morphed legends, stories, rumours, myth, were encoded into religion, into the works of the great books of religion, and into the idea of a God. it seemed quite apparent to me that in terms of my comfort, in terms of my happiness, in terms of the things that would avoid me falling into catastrophe, this approach had been pretty futile. Once we moved from the idea of superstition to the idea of cause and effect, of the past and the future, suddenly we were able to predict what was going to happen in the future. And after hundreds of thousands of years of human beings existing in one state, human beings changed rapidly. I was very aware that the age that I lived in, full of hospitals and television and fast food and records and music and drum kits and guitars and synthesizers, that had existed in the blink of an eye in terms of the history of mankind. And in terms of the history of the earth, a fraction of a blink of an eye. I became very grateful for what science had done to be able to whip this chaotic world into a world of order. I believe that this had been created by human beings' ability to step outside themselves and see material reality, to turn away from the ideas of tree spirits or wind spirits or the Father, Son, or the Holy Ghost. I knew that this was a superstition, and I felt the utility of that was only there to express the control of those who had chosen to rule over us. By my early 20s, I was a vehement atheist. And as I practiced my drums and I moved into my music career, I also started to think in terms of what God could be. What could God be? I tried to come up with some sort of definition so that I could destroy that definition, so that I could find fault in that definition. I found out through much thought that it was not actually possible to define God. We could say that God was all-powerful, omnipotent. We could say that God was everywhere, in everything. But of course, if God is all-powerful and everywhere, then God is just the name for everything. When I said this to believers, they said, no, but God's not just that. God knows who you are, and God loves you, and God will look after you, but only if you bow down to God. To me, this seemed awful. And so, in my looking for a definition of God, and the contradictory aspects by even just trying to do that, it became apparent that God could not be defined, and something that could not be defined then cannot be proved to exist or not exist. But my spirituality, the succor that I got that kept me going in life, came from music. My meditation was practice. My religious experience was playing music, and even sometimes just simply listening to music. I became aware that when I played music, that I was trying to get into a certain space, not a material space, but another space that could not be described, but it existed. The thing I realized with music was, for all the methods I had got to avoid these imagined catastrophes, I realized that nothing could be created in your musical approach that could guarantee access to that space. But that space would sometimes reveal itself in situations where the preparation did not seem conducive to entering that space. I could practice and practice, I could learn every note of the music, I could turn up, I could have ate properly, slept properly, but when I played, the magic didn't happen. But other times I could just turn up somewhere, not with any real idea, sit down with a bunch of musicians I didn't know, and very quickly I was in that space. I started to realise that this was key to creating music. That the ego and the idea of looking foolish, of going wrong, was the enemy. It was the enemy of creativity. This idea came from this imagined place. The place that I entered, the sublime place where everything unified, became a rod which I beat myself with. The idea of this space in which everything was perfect somehow would stop access to that place, because the idea of being perfect was to do with my ego. And it became very apparent to me that when I was playing well, when I could access that place, it was not me that was doing it. And I felt so many other musicians said the same thing to me. We knew what we were trying to get at, but this thing couldn't be got at easily. In my early 20s, I picked up a book by P.D. Ouspensky called A New Model of the Universe. The first chapter of that described the esoteric, this idea that the world could be divided into two areas. The exoteric, this is what we could see, what we understand, is what everybody did, what everybody knew. But through an application of acquiring knowledge and enlightenment, you could get another view. And this was the esoteric view. You could see the world in another way. Not being a chess player, when I watched people playing chess, I'd simply see people moving wooden shapes on a checkerboard into different places. I'm aware that they're trying to trap the other person. I'm aware that there are things going on. But for a grandmaster chess player, when they look at it, they would see something entirely different. They would see the esoteric aspects of the layout of those shapes. They would be able to see an order that I could not see. This order that we were trying to get at, which could be at once something that would attack you, the tyranny of order, or the sublime reality of order, which could also be described as balance. This was something that required knowledge, an esoteric search. The search had begun with ballistic to music, and then the search had moved on to me practicing music. I had spent a great amount of time doing the same repeated exercises and maintaining focus for hours on end. But after doing this, I felt that there was something beyond that, and it required a knowledge of the esoteric nature of the world. But this idea was at odds with my lack of belief. The idea of defining God, the idea of trying to come up with parameters for God, and that was not possible for me, proved that God did not exist. But music was about, to me, and it took me many years to come to this conclusion, but after a lifetime spent doing music, I came to realize that music embodied chaos and order, and what it did was balance these two. so that they worked together. And it was that that would banish the anxiety. The idea of living zombie-like in an eternal nowiness, this would have been the worst place to be in, and chaos would have met my outcome by trying to live a life continually in the eternal now. That human beings required both of these things. But then, and this has happened only recently over the last few years, I have started to look at the universe and I've started to ask myself this, and it is like the antithesis of the denying the existence of God through definition. That the universe was at once chaos and order, but everything in the universe could be seen as the powers of entropy, of chaos, pulling at the force of order, and the order was continually moving up a scale. My study of P.D. Ouspensky's new model of the universe had brought me to a mystical philosopher called G.I. Gurdjieff. And although I did not believe in God, Gurdjieff's idea of God was at the top of a scale of existence. That I lived in a world, and that world ran from material rocks to plants to animals to human beings, and then it broke beyond human beings out into the universe of the suns and planets, and this was ascending towards a certain point. And that the esoteric aspects of music was actually the ability of music to reveal these things, and to reveal these things practically, that the major scale embodied that movement upwards. The Jacob's Ladder described in that Rush song, and that became the title of the Brad Mehldau album that I talked about earlier this week. That ladder, that upward ladder, if you look at the cover of that album, you can see that that ladder moves in a straight line, and then it reaches a point and the direction changes. There is a shock that knocks that upward movement off. And this is embodied in the major scale by the lack of a black note between E and F, and the lack of a black note between B and C. And from B and C we move to the next octave, a higher octave. This was the fundamental underpinning. The law of the octave was the underpinning of Gurdjieff's worldview, which he stated went back thousands of years. I was fascinated by this esoteric idea. But I was also aware that in the Bible was the same description, that God had created the world in 7 days. 7 days. The same notes as that we have in an octave. And that order had happened. And then my material scientific background kicked in. And the thing that I became aware of, unalterably, this could not be denied, is the universe, stated by science, the whole aspect of the universe seemed to be the ascendancy of a huge scale that moved from quantum particles to subatomic particles, to atoms, to molecules, to compounds, from compounds to material reality, stones and rocks. But then it forms into planets, and the planets evolve, and the planets create a space in which these chemicals can turn into plants. The plants seem to have a will that is now embodied within the plant, that the plant is more than just the chemicals, for the plant can reach to the sun. Plants become animals, and animals evolve. There is a moving forward, that the whole universe is driving forward at the same time. Is it driving forward to some moral place that us human beings have invented? Absolutely not. But it was categorically the place that order was emerging out of the universe. That there were two directions, and you could see how entropy and chaos worked. The animals would die, they would rot away, and chaos would envelop that corpse, returning the chemicals into the ground to then re-emerge in new animals. But these new animals were more and more complex, and eventually consciousness switched on in those animals. If consciousness does switch on, but there were different types of consciousness. I look at my pet dog and I look at my pet cat, and I look into their eyes and I'm aware of consciousness which is identical to mine. They do not exist in a reality that is any less than mine, but their consciousness is different. The quality of consciousness was also moving forward. That consciousness was the aspect of the universe becoming aware of itself, as described in the Bible. That God created the heaven and earth and then put human beings, Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden, so that he had someone to appreciate who he was. When I was young, that seemed like a very egomaniacal statement. But that idea of the tree spirit means we have always embodied in God's a way of understanding what God could be, and that is a reflection of us. But I became aware that this ascending scale either stopped or went ever upwards, and where it was heading was to a place or a thing or an idea which has been called the monad. And the monad is often in esoteric symbols embodied by a circle with a dot in the middle. The sun, or the son of all suns. Frank Zappa, the great material composer that would sing scatological songs that exposed the chaotic reality of human beings, said that all his music was part of the big notes. At the top of everything was one big note from which all the other notes were placed. That is another way of imagining God. And I became aware that the ability to define God or not be able to define God was merely the ability to not be able to define the situation in which we find us. And at the end of that scale is either something or nothing. And the absolute nothingness is counterintuitive, because we know there is something, and that something either has an infinite totality or a finite totality. But both of those embody the totality of everything. And if the universe contains order, if the universe contains an upward movement up that scale to higher levels of consciousness, to higher levels of existence, then where would be the evidence to those higher levels existing? And there it was in the music. The music exposed a higher level of existence. And what levels lay beyond that? And when we got to the end of that, infinite or finite, it did not matter. We could give that a name.